Um, Good evening, everybody. We are just about 13 minutes late. Apology for the delays, but thank you everybody for coming and braving the cold. Occasion is very special. Professor Menon speaking all the way from South Africa, University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. But before I introduce the speaker, I will invite Umang to introduce Boston Study Group that is sponsoring this event.
Good evening, friends. My name is Umang, as Suraj said, and let me get in front of the live stream. So, wanted to welcome you all to this evening's lecture, the Ambedkar series lecture, organized by the Boston Study Group. Boston Study Group was founded about 2 years ago, as primarily, as the name suggests, as a study group, as an Ambedkarite study group. And since then, it has blossomed as a group that advocates for equity and justice, and it sort of manages itself and engages on Ambedkarite principles, but also on principles of other social reformers like Phule and Ravidas. So this evening, we also host monthly. We try to host monthly Ambedkar lecture series, and this one in November is part of our ongoing series of lectures, and we are of course very happy to have Professor Menon here. I'll tell you a bit about the topic, and then I'll invite Suraj to introduce Professor Menon. Today's topic is Master and Slaves, Rethinking What Congress and Gandhi Have Done to the Untouchables. What Congress and Gandhi have done to the Untouchables is an essay by Dr. Ambedkar, and you can find it online, and it's an extremely it's an essay in which Ambedkar it's a book. Sorry, yeah, it's a book in which Ambedkar engages at length with the way Gandhi dealt with the issue of what were called untouchables, right from the beginning of the formation of, or when he joined the Indian National Congress. So Gandhi also had a response to that, and then Ambedkar had a response to that. So, I think it needs rethink, constant rethink, and we are very pleased to have Professor Menon, Dilip Menon from University of Wits, that's what I'll call it, Witwatersrand. Am I pronouncing it right?
It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Okay. But it's a premier institute in South Africa, and I was also fortunate of learning about it several years ago when I was myself doing a paper on an alternative version to Gandhi's stay in South Africa. But at any rate, I'd like to invite Suraj Yengde, who's a fellow here at the Du Bois Center, and also a postdoctoral research student at the African and African American Studies Department, and who also happens to be Professor Menon's student. So, Suraj, if you would introduce Professor Menon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Umang. Let's jump into the talk. But before, brief introduction about Professor Menon. Professor Menon has a PhD from the University of Cambridge in history. In the year 1990, he wrote his thesis on the topic was Caste, nationalism, and communism in Malabar, 1900s to 1948. He's currently a Mellon Chair in Indian Studies and director of the Center for Indian Studies in Africa, both at WITS. He has held respectable visiting fellowships and awards, some of being at University of Barcelona, Yale, Stellenbosch, among others. Prior to going to WITS, he taught at he held teaching positions at the University of Delhi, University of Hyderabad, University of Cambridge, Yale. And also, he has this personality. He's a historian, but he has given talks, and he has his extensive analytical rigor on the topics varying from history, culture, films, theory, literary criticism. Some of his talks were entitled, "Is Hierarchy the Same as Inequality? Thinking Through Louis Dumont." One of the talks he gave was on South Asian history after subaltern studies. Another was Race, Space, and Grace, Imagine Affinities Across India, South Africa, and the USA. He's also on the editorial board of several journals, some of them being Indian Folklore Research Journal, Indian Economic and Social History Review, Journal of Asian Studies, among others. He's also a thinker who could be counted upon when I think modernity is discovering itself deep stuck in the quandaries of its own logos, and he is someone who distills this critical and highly inaccessible scholarship to make it more mellow and soundish. He's credited, and it will be uh, fit for this audience to know, to have an intellectually oriented seminar dedicated to the ideas of Ambedkar, the first perhaps that was hosted in African continent, which was about Ambedkar's dharma, freedom, sovereignty, and politics, which are in collaboration, of course, with Continental of India. He has also produced a film, An African Odyssey, in collaboration with Oxford Media on the occasion of 150 years of Indian indenture labor. He's also author of a book, Caste, Nationalism, and Communism in India, which was published in Malabar, which was, of course, his thesis. And one of the most important contributions on communalism and caste, which we talk about here when we talk about issues of communalism, Professor Menon traces back to the historicity of the existence of caste vignettes, the caste fragments existing in this violence, and he gives us beautiful history as well as comments on these conditions as to why caste effaces from our conversation. And one of my favorite books is this, The Blindness of Insight, Essays on Caste in Modern India. And one of my favorite, I mean, of course, there's very provocative topics, but one of them I loved is Being a Brahmin the Marxist Way. And then he goes on to the founders, one of the founders of the Marxist movement in India, but Kerala mostly, E.M.S. Namudripad, the Brahmin himself, and he doesn't mince words. What he writes, among many other things, I'll just read out, so it will give us some of the understanding of where is he coming from. He says EMS, which is Namudripad's work, which he wrote on Marxism and caste, is a powerful example of the Brahmin coming of age in South India. Then he goes on, EMS's use of Marxism and its concepts is idiocentric at best and instrumental at worst. And when he is talking about this notion, he's tracing back to the writings of the evolution of the Brahmin Übermensch and the thought of Brahmins, in the formation of the national histories. But more importantly, he's juxtaposing that with the way E.M.S. Namudripad frames the history of Kerala as something that is coming from within the dictum of the Brahmin-oriented, philosophical as well as social historical thought, and then he puts that with the national histories, which also talk about the same perspective. So we see both the communist, the extreme left, as well as the nationalist movement falling under the same altar. With further ado, I will invite Professor Menon to deliberate on this very important topic, and it was very rightly titled Master and Slaves, Rethinking What Congress and Gandhi Have Done to the Untouchables, a very powerful critique written by someone when Gandhi and Congress was praised across the world, even the third world and the Western world. Professor Menon, thank you for coming.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to have one student introduce one. I mean, there's a kind of uncritical admiration, which is why one has students and one has children and so on. But thanks, Suraj, and I hope, but as my professor used to say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So I hope what I present will be something that will be both enlightening as well as allow you to think through probably the foremost intellectual of the 20th century from India. There's one book which came out recently, which has been an extraordinary influence on me. There is somebody who is, again, a former student when I was at Cambridge, Aishwari Kumar, who now teaches at Stanford. It's a book called Radical Equality, Ambedkar, Gandhi, and the Risk of Democracy. And it's an extraordinarily profound book, and probably the first book that takes on both Gandhi and Ambedkar's thinking. And Aishwari Kumar resists the post-colonial urge to institute Gandhi as a political philosopher and looks at Ambedkar's thinking on political sovereignty, the question of democracy, and the question of the individual and the mastery of the self in a deeply profound way, which is also at the same time a critique of what Gandhi represents in terms of the curtailing of the possibilities of the self in modern India. So this is a book I would recommend. It's a poetic book. It's a difficult book, but it's also a very poetic and very inspiring book to read. So that's my plug for Aishwari Kumar's book. What Congress and Gandhi have done to the Untouchables, which was written in 1945, is generally seen as hinging on one word. Right? What Congress and Gandhi have done to the Untouchables, not what Congress and Gandhi have done for the Untouchables. Because the entire nationalist narrative, and indeed the Gandhian narrative, hinges on the word for, where Gandhi acts, performs an exemplarity, as it were. His life is an attempt to do something for India, for the untouchable, for the women, for tribals, and so on and so forth. So Ambedkar writes prose precisely, so one has to pay attention to the fact that he chooses the word to, that Gandhi acts upon rather than for the untouchable. But if we are to look at this text as a text that is a critique of Gandhi, I think we'd be wide off the mark. And that's what I want to talk about, because one of the things that we are trying to do at the University of Witwatersrand is also, when we held the first conference 2 years ago, was to get thinkers from around the world to look at one text each. So this was the text that I chose to read and work with, and I still think I'm in an initial phase of reading because Ambedkar is extraordinarily widely read. Right? So he is as au fait with Greek philosophy as he is with contemporary theories of liberal democracy, as he is with Pali texts, Sanskrit texts, and so on. So one can only follow in his wake, kind of lag behind in his wake. And at some point, I think I will be able to write this up, and I've got over the sense of the lack of a matching erudition. So the book actually goes back to the idea of the 1932 Pune Pact, where Ambedkar makes a demand for separate electorates. Gandhi then stamps his foot like a spoiled child and says, "I will fast unto the death." Right? As you know, Gandhi's fasts were never premised on his actually dying. Right? He didn't die of a fast, as we know, throughout his career. So these are strategic moments. But Gandhi's fast actually puts Ambedkar in the public eye as somebody who would take away the life of the national leader. And since 1932, Gandhi and Ambedkar have always been seen as a dyad. They're studied together as two possibilities in modern India. And there's always been this attempt by political philosophers to reconcile the two posthumously. If they fought while they were alive, the entire purpose of Indian academia has been to reconcile them after death. To say, well, Gandhi tempered Ambedkar's thought, Ambedkar tempered Gandhi's thought, Ambedkar made Gandhi more radical, Gandhi made Ambedkar mellow, and so on and so forth. And I think it is time that we studied Ambedkar on his own terms as a political philosopher, because despite common wisdom, it is Ambedkar who is the intellectual and Gandhi who is the politician. Ambedkar was a spectacular failure as a politician. He never managed to win a single election. But what he did produce was an extraordinary series of scholarly texts, which only now we are beginning to take seriously. Again, the other dyad that Ambedkar gets locked into is that of the dyad with Nehru, where Nehru represents a belief in industrial modernity and the idea of equality under the Constitution. And we tend to assume that Ambedkar's, having chaired the Constituent Assembly, reflects his belief in the possibility of a constitutional equality, whereas Ambedkar was willing to let go of the Constitution. Just as he burned the Manusmriti in the past, he said, "I would equally burn this Constitution," because he could see the limits of liberal democracy in a caste society. So that is the heart of the argument that I will be trying to make, that what this book is a critique of the very possibility of democracy in a country that is governed by caste and the limits that this imposes. And he resisted. Ambedkar constantly resisted what he called the mathematical exactitude that the liberal democracy of India was premised on. It's on a democracy based on numbers, on balancing numbers, on giving reservations to people, creating affirmative action, when none of these ideas actually thought about the sovereignty of the individual, the dignity of the individual, the respect of the individual. It was a system of graded sovereignty, as he put it, in annihilation of caste. And this was also a reaction to Gandhi's obsession with numbers, because during the Pune Pact, One of the ways in which Gandhi trumped Ambedkar was through the fast. The other was to produce a series of numbers in a very lawyerly fashion to show that what we needed was more a balancing out. Right? And we'll come back to this idea as to why equality is not enough. And this was Ambedkar's constant argument, that democracy is based on liberty and equality, but India, democracy is not based on the third missing element, that of fraternity, because caste precludes fraternity, right? And fellowship, the idea of fellowship between humans. If we think about, again, a triad, to stay with this idea of this constant playing off of Ambedkar against Gandhi and Nehru, Ambedkar was somebody who believed in the idea of recuperating self, recuperating sovereignty, recuperating rights through history, rather than resorting to the idea of civilization. Gandhi rejected history. Right? Gandhi saw history as merely a series of events. And he went back to the idea of an Indian civilization and recovering civilization as an ideal. So Hind Swaraj, which he writes in 1909, is basically a positing of the idea of Indian civilization to show that Indians were worthy, right? That they were not to be classed with the African who lacked civilization, who was a mere barbarian. Right? This is something that I've published very recently in the journal History of the Present, where Gandhi's idea of civilization is forged in South Africa as against the black. So the fundamental argument of Hind Swaraj is we are not blacks. We are a people with a civilization. Right? And what that allows him to do is also to create a whole within which caste need not be thought about. Right? And where, again, Gandhi could perform the politics of exemplarity, to act on behalf of. Nehru, as you know, was also somebody who thought with the idea of civilization, whether it's glimpses of world history, discovery of India, the idea of multiple intersecting civilizations. And he was very much in the mold, Nehru was very much in the mold of Spengler, H.G. Wells. In the late 19th and the early 20th century, there was this idea of the civilizational connections. But for Ambedkar, history was crucial. The archive was crucial. Texts and their interpretation were crucial. And an attention to the present and the oppression of the present was crucial. So it wasn't enough for Ambedkar to resort to this idea of something called Indian civilization, inchoate, benevolent, and so on. All his writings were about the oppression of the present and the denial of self to the untouchable. The most important thing to think about with Ambedkar is the fact of experience. Gandhi was a patrician, right? He came from a lineage where his father and his father before him had been counselors to the princes, to the kings of Gujarat. Nehru was a newly born, a nouveau patrician, if there is such a word. Ambedkar, if you were to read his autobiographical fragments, as well as if you were to read Dhananjay Keer's biography, one of the fundamental things that you realize about Ambedkar's life is abjection, the sheer abjection. Right? For a man who was probably the most educated man in India of his time, it is this constant, how his caste dogs him all his life. And if you imagine Ambedkar's travels through the landscape of India, you're also imagining that as he traveled through the landscape of India, each site was being cleansed, even as he passed through it, because he was an untouchable. This is something to remember, something to bear in mind. Right? When we think about this thinker who's thinking about what it means, right? Where you put a humiliation at the heart of thinking of the self, which neither Gandhi being thrown off the train is the one instance of humiliation that we know about, right? Ambedkar's life was a life of humiliation, as you can see through the idea that his sister cut his hair. If you've seen older photographs of Ambedkar's hair, is fairly ragged, because only his sister would cut his hair. Nobody would touch him. His sister cut his hair for him. When he gets married in a cycle shed in Baikala in Mumbai. One half of the bicycle shed is used for his marriage, then he and his wife sleep on the other half. So these are things that we need to bring back into our understanding of these texts. We can't divorce it from the experiences that he goes through, this consistent ill treatment by the officials of the Gaikwad of Baroda. So once the Maharaja of Baroda sends him abroad for an education, he gets an education at Columbia, London School of Economics, comes back, he has files thrown at him by his Brahmin attendants because they will refuse to touch a file that Ambedkar has touched. Gandhi, when he first heard, was about to negotiate with Ambedkar in 1932, Gandhi just assumed that Ambedkar was Brahmin. Yeah? And he was astonished to find that Ambedkar was an untouchable. Now, all of these are things that do not attend upon our thought. And Gandhi just assumed that Ambedkar was Brahmin because Ambedkar is the man from Ambavadi, the village of Ambavadi, like you have Tendulkar, Vengsarkar, and so on. The most important thing to know about Ambedkar is that Ambedkar is not his name. This again, very few people know. His name is Bhim Rao Sakpal. The name Ambedkar is given to him by a Brahmin teacher when he's a young boy. So the man whom we know as Ambedkar has a name that is not his, a name that is a gift of a Brahmin, a brand that he bears all his life. Right? So one needs to say all of this because a lot of people to whom I speak and I say, do you know that Ambedkar is not Ambedkar's name? And they're kind of astonished to realize that it is not his real name, right? That his name is Bhimrao Sakpal. So let's get back to the argument after these preliminary observations. This book is at one level a critique of Gandhi, a critique of the Pune Pact, a critique of Gandhi's manipulation of figures, his mathematical exactitude, and the dealing with numbers. But the book is also about the limits of liberal democracy. So we know about multiple political thinkers, whether it's Carl Schmitt and others who have explored the limits of liberal democracy. Ambedkar was one of the most profound thinkers of the limits of liberal democracy in the 20th century. So ostensibly, the book is about the perfidy of the Congress and of Gandhi towards the Untouchables in the light of the Pune Pact and the Round Table Congress. The original title was What the Hindus Have Done to the Untouchables, right? Which then becomes What Congress and Gandhi Have Done to the Untouchables, and it's not without significance that there is this illusion that is happening. Because the Congress and Gandhi represent the Hindus and represent Hindu caste society. So what seems like a renaming is actually an act of precision at the same time. And the book is a substantial critique of the possibilities implied in freedom from the British, the question of self-government and parliamentary democracy. And when the book is published again in 1946, Ambedkar stresses again, there's a condensed version of a critique of parliamentary democracy which comes at the end of the book to make clear to the reader that this is what the book is about. So those of you who read the text that's available online, you'll see the 1945 edition and then there's the 1946 revised edition with an added chapter which reiterates much of the arguments which are made against parliamentary democracy. When we read Ambedkar, the important question is also to ask, how are we to read Ambedkar? Right? We have to attend to this because Ambedkar writes in many forms and in many ways, in a polemical tone, in a historical tone, through appeals to the imagination, through appeals to fact, so the multiple registers that run through each text, and which is why we need to be attentive to this. Not every text can be read the same way. So to read Buddha and his Dhamma, one has to adopt a different strategy than that one adopts when reading what Congress and Gandhi have done to the Untouchables. The book begins with an epigraph from Thucydides, right? I mean, again, as I said, there's an extraordinary range of references in Ambedkar. It begins with an epigraph from Thucydides, and the quote goes, "It may be in your interest to be our masters, but how can it be ours to be your slaves?" Now, one of the important things about this is that, again, when we think about Ambedkar's entire enterprise, as it were, intellectual and political enterprise, it is not about a struggle for recognition. It's a rejection of recognition. It's a rejection of recognition because recognition is a mere gift that may or may not be given to the untouchable. This is about positing a radical, immeasurable sovereignty. It is about asserting the immeasurable sovereignty of the untouchable, that the untouchable has a self that exceeds any act of recognition that may be given to the untouchable by Gandhi, by democracy, by the constitution, and so on. Later on in the text, he cites one of Gandhi's sophistries that addresses the issue of caste inequality, where Gandhi says that Gandhi is a member of a slave nation. And Gandhi says, as a slave, I have not the freedom even to do the right thing. So there is a way in which Gandhi positions himself strategically in the position of the slave. But at the same time, Gandhi claims to represent in himself the vast mass of the untouchables, those who he says have childlike faith in my wisdom. So if Gandhi is a slave, the untouchables are doubly enslaved by Gandhi's gesture of incorporation, those who depend upon him in their childlike wisdom for recognition, protection, and so forth. So Gandhi positions himself simultaneously as master and slave at the same time. Right? And it is this sophistry that enrages Ambedkar. So part of what Congress and Gandhi has done to the untouchables is a kind of rage against the sophistries that Gandhi practices in the political domain in the name of asceticism, in the name of self-abnegation, and so on and so forth. So Gandhi becomes a symptom as much as a gatekeeper of caste domination. Right? Gandhi is a metaphor of caste domination. He's also the enforcer, as it were. And there is a wonderful phrase in The Annihilation of Caste where Ambedkar says, and I quote, "All are slaves of the caste system, but all slaves are not equal in status." The Orwellian overtones of this are very resonant. Right? Some are more equal than the others. So if all are slaves of the caste system, but not all slaves are equal in status. So when one thinks about the dialectic between masters and slaves, what you're dealing with is a field of slaves, right? And the deceit of mastery that Gandhi poses through satyagraha, through dominance of the self. But that dominance and the control of the self is towards the subordination of the other. Right? It is a mastery that is not a mastery accorded to all. It is a mastery exercised over the self and over another being. The book is dedicated to a lady who's named as F, right? With whom he read the Bible in London, and he recalls the story of Naomi and Ruth's pledge to Naomi. "Thy people shall be my people, and thy God shall be my God." And Ambedkar replies that if a traditional society is a society of man plus God, modern society is a society of men only. And he's careful to point out that by using the word men, he includes women as well, right? Which is an unusual move at that time where these words were used fairly casually as to encompassing the other half. And one of the ideas that he puts forward in this idea of modern society being a society of humans without the necessity of God is the idea that religion is a matter of principle. Right? Religion cannot be a matter of rules. And he sees Hinduism as a religion that is governed only by rules. Thou shalt not do this, or thou shalt do this. And he says it has to be about principles and about the use of prajna, which is a discriminating intelligence, which allows one to recognize not only maitri, which is the fellowship of human beings, something that exceeds both freedom and equality. Right? And he says the Hindus worship this triguna, the ideas of the three, so liberty, equality, and fraternity appeal to them as a triad, but it is maitri that is absent from that triad. We have merely liberty, merely equality, but never fellow feeling. And therefore, Ambedkar is very skeptical towards the idea of society, nation, country, nationalism, all of which leave aside the possibility of fellowship and of maitri, an idea that he derives from Buddhism. He goes on to say in this book that Gandhi values his reputation as the savior of the untouchables, he does not value Swaraj, which is freedom. True freedom would mean that Gandhi would no longer be someone who was necessary. Right? But Gandhi constantly presents himself as an exemplar. He's the Christ who will crucify himself for an adoring mass. Right? Gandhi performs the fast, Gandhi performs the politics, and the masses shall be the admiring hordes who will gather to watch the sacrifice done on their behalf. And he says Gandhi values his reputation as savior, he does not value Swaraj, the goal of ahimsa and the means. He says whether one is thinking about the goal, that of freedom, or one is thinking about the means when Gandhi speaks about ahimsa, the important thing is what gets left aside. Right? And this question of Maitri haunts this book. And Maitri, the idea of fraternity, is going to be central to the last text that Ambedkar writes, which is unfinished, Buddha and his Dhamma, where the entire premise of a new society will be that of fellowship. In the late 19th century, the Congress made the choice of the political over the social. When the Indian National Congress was founded in 1885, for many of the earlier sessions, a social conference was held parallel to the political conference, and the Congress gives up on this. So they prefer the political over the social. And what Ambedkar is trying to speak about in this text is that what happens to the desire in the Congress to ameliorate social inequality. It becomes converted into the Swaraj Fund, right? Creating funds which would be devoted to the upliftment of the untouchable, the upliftment of the lower caste, and so on. And then Ambedkar embarks on a mathematics to show you how the funds are actually allocated, that a large number of the funds are allocated to Gandhi, they're allocated to the province of Gujarat. So what he shows through combating Gandhi's mathematical exactitude is to show that even as the Congress has moved away from its earlier social purpose and moved towards a politics of amelioration and of providing funds for the untouchable, that these funds are not going towards the untouchable. They're going towards personalities, they're going towards regions, and so on. And even in the case of the Harijan Sevak Sangh, which Gandhi founds, the Harijan Sevak Sangh is very clear about excluding untouchables from leadership, because Gandhi says that the very act of resolving caste has to be an act of self-abnegation on the part of the upper caste. It is a change of mind among the upper caste that's needed, that the untouchable does not need to lead the organizations that will work for the untouchable. So it's a further sophistry that Ambedkar is engaging with in this and critiquing in the book. When Gandhi says in a series of pronouncements that those who speak of the political rights of the untouchables do not know their India, right? This is the argument that Gandhi makes during the Roundtable Conference, that when Ambedkar makes a right that the untouchables have political rights, he says the untouchables don't have any political rights or don't need political rights independent of their belonging in Hinduism. Ambedkar's argument is that their only belonging in Hinduism is as subordinates. Right? So this constant idea of absorbing the untouchables, the politics of numbers that is being played out in nationalism, where Gandhi and the Congress represent everybody on the landscape. One secession is going to happen when Jinnah and the Muslim League reject that. Right? Where they say the Congress does not represent the Muslims, and Jinnah then begins to speak about himself as the sole spokesman of the Muslims. In 1932, when Gandhi speaks to Ramsay MacDonald at the Roundtable Conference, he says, this matter is one of pure religion. The untouchables do not have separate political rights. This is a matter of religion. Now, why does he pose it as that? Because going back to 1858, when the Queen's Proclamation, when India becomes a colony, the idea is that the British shall no longer interfere in the customs and the religion of the Indians, because the idea is that 1857, the Great Rebellion occurred because of colonial intervention. So Gandhi is playing a certain kind of rhetoric to the British where he says this matter is one of pure religion, which means that Gandhi arbitrates this. Ambedkar has no role to play in this because Gandhi represents in himself and in his politics the very idea of Hinduism itself. Ambedkar's argument here is that if one thinks about Hinduism as a religion, this is a religion that comes with untouchability. This is not a religion that comes with the idea of emancipation. Untouchables repudiate it. They are separate because they are separated. It's not as if the untouchable chooses to walk out of Hinduism. That is indeed the existential condition, that to be a part of Hinduism is to be subordinate. So the idea of this being merely a religious argument, as Gandhi puts it, right, where Gandhi says that this matter is one of pure religion, Ambedkar's argument is, yes, even if this is a matter of pure religion, untouchables belong in Hinduism only through their exclusion. It's a paradoxical belonging. And what we have here is that there is a cordon sanitaire, as he says. It's like a line that runs through Hinduism, fenced with barbed wire, right, which separates the untouchables from the upper castes. And that is what the recognition of political sovereignty has to be, that there is a mastery that the untouchable has to exercise over themselves, that there is the desire for political sovereignty comes from the exclusion of from the entity to which they are seen to belong. But a line drawn with barbed wire, a cordon sanitaire that separates the upper caste and the lower castes. And he says what we are dealing with is not a religious system, but a mental attitude, a 2,000-year twist of the human mind. Right? And the various points when you read Ambedkar and you get, I get goosepimples, because this is the way in which he condenses his rage into metaphors, condenses his rage into images that stay in one's mind. Like that classic formulation, lapidary formulation, where he says caste is not a division of labor, it's a division of laborers, right? Which is a response that he also has to the possibility of the Communist Party's engagement with caste. In a letter to A.V. Thakur, who is Gandhi's right-hand man and who deals with the issue of tribals, the Adivasis, Ambedkar writes to him in November 1932, and he says that Gandhi's strategy of making the caste Hindu alter their ways, right, that as if it is a matter of gentle amelioration, 2,000 years are not enough. We need a gentle amelioration, the upper caste has to be convinced and so on. And he says what we need is to create a crisis. And this is the idea of general mobilization that runs through Ambedkar's thinking in what Congress and Gandhi have done to the untouchables, as well as throughout his writing, that we need to create a crisis by direct action. And following the policy of least resistance and a silent infiltration of rational ideas do not compel thought, for they do not produce crisis. So this very idea of general mobilization, compelling thought, producing crisis, all of these are themes that run through what Congress and Gandhi have done to the untouchables. So in that sense, many of the ideas that are there in this exceed that engagement with Gandhi alone, which seems to be part of the title, right? And which is why a lot of people misread the book as being merely a polemic against Gandhi. What you have is a persistence, a staying with ideas that have obsessed him all the time, from 1930s, the annihilation of caste, to an attempt at a resolution in Buddha and his Dhamma in the 1950s. And this producing of crisis is central, because the transfer of power that might happen when India becomes independent will not produce that crisis. It will be a mere transition. It will not be a transfer of power, and it will be the creation of a clique, an oligarchy, or a group of people where democracy and adult franchise would not be adequate safeguards for the tyranny of what he calls the Hindu communal majority. What you will have is Hindu Raj, right, once India becomes independent. The transfer of power will really mean a British Raj becoming a Hindu Raj, which is why direct action, general mobilization, producing a crisis, and so on become important. Then there is a detailed analysis of the elections of Congress, where he does the kind of analysis that psephologists do now, where he plows through a huge number of these provincial results. We must remember that at that point, nobody was doing this kind of work, analyzing elections. And Ambedkar sits down and he looks at all the results province by province. He talks about the difficulty of obtaining these records on which to base his analysis. And one of the things that he shows, which is the kind of argument that we now make with regard to Modi or with regard to Trump winning the election, he shows very clearly that the Congress has secured less than half the votes and only 18% of the untouchable votes, but has still won the election. And he's asking the question, what does it mean to win elections in a democracy when you don't win a majority of the popular vote? So some of these early dissatisfactions in the way in which the idea of the first past the post system, the idea of elections as promoting democracy, Ambedkar is one of the first in India to articulate this even before India becomes independent. It's kind of ironic, since he's going to write the constitution and put the elections into place as something that will transform India. But even as he's doing this is written in 1945. 1947, August, he will head the Constituent Assembly. 1950, the constitution will be promulgated. But his sense of alienation from the very idea of liberal democracy, from the idea of elections, is fairly clear. One of the arguments that people make is that post-1950, there is a disillusionment that Ambedkar has with the constitution and with parliamentary democracy. The Hindu Code Bill is not passed, and then in sheer disgust or in sheer desolation, he converts to Buddhism. But this is a long time coming. There is a strand that runs through his thought all the way from the 1930s, where he is deeply pessimistic about the possibility of democracy in India, a society that is driven by caste, a society that is constituted by religion. And Gandhi becomes the exemplar of that, where Gandhi performs politics for the people. It's not a politics of the people. And he says, when you think about the Congress party, with its strong party machine, its more resources, the candidates are chosen on the basis of caste, wealth, qualifications, Brahmins with more, non-Brahmins with less. And he says elections are really like an army versus a crowd. When you think about the Congress in relation to all other political formation, it's like an army versus a crowd. What you have is a systematic organization that is not merely a political organization. It's a caste organization. It's a religious organization. The Congress is all of this. And against that army, that organized army, what you have is a mere crowd of untouchables who are never going to win. Right? The elections are never going to work for them. At the round table, Congress, Ambedkar had talked about political safeguards, equal citizenship, fundamental civic rights, getting rid of the social boycott, a whole set of things that, which again, when you read the book, you'll see that he iterates many of the arguments that he would see as providing safeguards. But even as he puts them in place, he's aware of the fact that this is not going to work in a society without Maitri, in a society where the possibility of fellowship doesn't exist. So when in 1942 at the All India Conference of Untouchables, when a questioner asked Gandhi about the nomination of members from among the scheduled castes legislators, Gandhi replies, and it's a very frank and brutal statement that Gandhi makes, where he says, cabinet ministers must be a topmost man commanding universal confidence. You cannot have untouchables. So you can see why Ambedkar is fairly clear when he's writing this book that parliamentary democracy is going to do nothing to change the landscape of inequality in India, because these attitudes continue to persist into contemporary India. Those of us who have grown up with these ideas of merit and, our universities are suffused with ideas of merit, but only some people seem to have merit and others don't, right? And that's the structuring of our university. So transfer of power becomes then a dangerous illusion, as Ambedkar puts it. It's not adult suffrage that's going to help, not even a constitutional morality, the idea that Ambedkar derives from Groth's study of ancient Greece, with its reverence for a set of principles that stood above political society. He says none of this is going to work. Why? He says Indian social life is one of communities. Inequality is also graded inequality. It's not mere inequality. It is a question of graded inequality where everybody has to see themselves in relation to those below them and those above them. It's a system of graded sovereignties, as he put it. The other phrase that he has in The Annihilation of Caste is an ascending scale of respect and a descending scale of contempt. That is the structuring of Indian society. I mean, these phrases, you just have to read them once. And you see in them a mind that struggled with the fundamental hierarchy, inegalitarianism, and violence of Indian society, and which he puts into these phrases which are born as much out of rage as an ability to cut through the illusions of politics that Gandhi spun during the course of the nationalist movement. And he says what we are dealing with in India is the religion of the Hindus. We are not dealing with a political landscape. So when Gandhi says to Ramsay MacDonald, this is a religious question, he's spot on. The political question in Gandhi's mind is a religious question, and Ambedkar sees it as such, that in the end, democracy is not going to trump this. And the Brahmins will remain the governing class. Detailed analysis when he looks at the elections of who gets voted, who is chosen to stand for election, and he shows the preponderance of Brahmins given their numerical insignificance in the population. Again, one of the first studies of this kind, which looks at electoral suffrage, which looks at the candidates, which, the kind of things that political scientists have begun to do in the last 30 or 40 years. And he says that at the end, when one thinks about Ambedkar, Ambedkar is usually paired along with Nehru as somebody who believes in this radical modernity. Right? If Gandhi was somebody who talked about khadi, self-sufficiency, the village, and so on, we know Ambedkar's views on the village, that it's a cesspool. It's a cesspool which subordinates, in which the untouchable has a place which is consigned to scavenging and so on and so forth. And he says it's not just railways and factories after independence, but the complete destruction of Brahmanism as a philosophy that should be at the heart of democracy. Because Brahmanism does not allow for Maitri, does not allow for fellowship. And untouchables must be seen as separate. And how does one think about the non-belonging of the untouchable and the entailments of that, the non-belonging of the untouchable within the system, within this religious system of Hinduism, which is also presented as the democracy of India. And finally, when he comes to write the Buddha and his Dhamma, he's returning to an idea which is present in his first crystalline formation, the annihilation of caste, an annihilation, a word that he derives from Buddhism, Uchedvad. He says, annihilation, a freedom without measure. How do we work towards a freedom without measure? A freedom that is available for everyone in equal measure. And in equal measure in an immeasurable kind of way, where freedom exists, and you proclaim an autonomy and a will that exists beyond the law. Right? It's not the Constitution that's going to provide fellow feeling. It's not the existence of legal provisions to make sure that everybody is equal. That's not going to promote fellowship. What we need is an autonomy and creating an autonomy and a political will that is beyond the law. Even as he was going to step into that Constituent Assembly and write a constitution. Right? So it's the irony of his placement. A man who writes the Constitution at the time deeply skeptical about the possibility of the freedom that Constitution can provide, where he sees the struggle for equality as a warlike condition, where equality constantly has to be at war with itself. The laws that confine equality to citizens alone, but does not create brotherhood. Right, and I'll stop there and maybe we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Menon. This was revealing to most of us. And thank you for that close and, as I said, mellow reading of this very profound text, and almost like a hermeneutic pause as we turn the pages. One of the things I think of this presentation was it was a simple reading. What was written there, you presented to us in the way that has to be presented, rather delving into abstract notions and values of. So that is very much appreciated. I will open up the questions. Whoever wants to ask, if you could just introduce yourself and then direct the question, I'd appreciate it.
Menon, I'm very interested in this. Already said I'm not very familiar with America. Of course, I've heard a lot of time about Gandhi, but I'm very curious now about this book. And I guess. So you see Ambedkar drafting the constitution. Is this the constitution that India still rules and applies today?
Yes.
Has he been able today to actually promote or give some representativity to the untouchable? Has it been successful so far? What has he succeeded on, and what has he failed on by drafting his constitution for you today?
Well, Ambedkar passes away in 1956, right? 6 years after the Constitution is drafted. And all his reservations and his skepticism regarding the possibilities of equality within the Constitution start being proved from the very day that the Constitution is promulgated and continue into the present. Because it's like in South Africa. In South Africa, we have a constitution which is perhaps one of the most beautiful documents ever written, right? Where there is equality and freedom on every page, but no equality and freedom outside of those pages. So it's a similar situation in India, where equality is written into every page of the constitution, but it is an equality that falls into an idea of equality that falls on barren soil. It falls on a soil in which the very idea of fellow feeling is precluded by the hierarchy and the violence of the caste system. Right? So that was something that he foresaw, which is why he said, I have no faith in this document that I've created, I could as well burn it. But it was a task that had to be done, and he did it. But even as he was doing that task, he realized that this was an insurmountable problem. Because what was needed was something that existed outside of the law. It needed to exceed the law. It needed to promote a kind of intemperate relation to the idea of an immeasurable equality, right? Such that doesn't exist. Right? One could argue that this doesn't exist in America as well, or most other societies. But that was the demand that he placed. Because one of the things about this idea of Maitri is that Maitri doesn't exist in the US. When you think about the US as well as a society that is governed by egalitarianism, but is undermined by race. Just as much as in India, we aspire to equality, but it's undermined by caste. So Ambedkar in that sense was disillusioned with the constitution that he wrote. He was disillusioned with the possibilities of Hindu society. And we don't know where he would have gone, right? In 1956, he converts to Buddhism along with 500,000 followers. A remarkable act. I mean, by the Indian population, 500,000 is not a large number, but in the annals of world history, 500,000 people leaving a religion and joining another is a very significant act. But then he dies shortly thereafter, leaving the text of the Buddha and his Dhamma unfinished. So we don't know what might have happened after that.
Kind of breaking the silence. See, when we look at Ambedkar at this moment, it's the moment when India is negotiating its independence, but also it is represented as the Asian, country that is kicking the white imperial power structures, and that's why we see this affinity to the Indian freedom struggle. And within that cacophony, we see this man, when the world almost, even I was reading the Marxist journal, Marxist website, and they had very critical commentaries about this. So, in the way, when the liberal as well as radical discourse was not in favor of Ambedkar, domestically as well as globally, and this man has this, courage to stand at that point and speak the truth. So I see it as a Fenonian moment. In the sense of, all right, we are pitching for a liberal democracy, or a democracy that we want to do, but what do we do after that? Which Fanon is also wrestling with this very important question that post-colonial elites might loot us, And then I see that with the invocation of Du Bois, for example, where Du Bois sees no alternative to work in the existing structures that have been inherited. So for me, this is very, this is like an amalgamation of what Du Bois and Fanon are saying, but in a kind of book form that Ambedkar offers. Do you think there could be such kind of examples that we could maybe compare?
No, I think one can enter into a field of infinite comparisons, but I'm not sure how useful that would be at the moment. Because there is a particularity to the idea of caste that Ambedkar is wrestling with. And he's very clear that it is not only the abstractions of democracy that concern him, but with the quiddity of caste. Right? Caste, we can talk about Fanon, we can talk about Du Bois, but you're talking about different landscapes. So while Ambedkar draws upon a literature that goes to Rousseau, to Durkheim, to John Dewey, there's a whole world of thought that he draws upon. It is to address this one thing. That is the perplex, it's a perplex at the heart of Indian society. Why is it that one Indian cannot respect or accord dignity to another? There is something about caste that prevents that. Right? And this is something that, even when I was teaching in India, this was something that would happen in a classroom, in a class of 30, 10 years that I taught at Delhi University. At the end of the class, I would ask the students, so can anyone stand up and name all the other students in the class? And they couldn't. And I could, since I had been teaching them. But in all those 10 years at Delhi University, they couldn't, because that class was riven. It was riven by multiple, how should I put it? Multiple separations which came not only from caste, from region, from language, from religion, all kinds of things, all kinds of groupings. And there were only 30 people. In a class of 800, one can understand, or 1,000 or whatever. So that thing that separates one human from the other, right, which prevents the possibility of one human actually even for, transgressing. And each transgression is met with death. Right? When you think about Ambedkar's passionate appeals in the Constituent Assembly against the institution of the death penalty, right? One of the reasons why he argues against the death penalty is also because the fact of the death penalty being at the heart of the caste system. Transgression is met with killing, when it is a sanctioned killing. It is a killing that is sanctioned by religion, by tradition, and so on. So Ambedkar does not take death lightly. It's not, again, this is polemic, but Gandhi takes death very lightly. He's constantly putting before the public the possibility of his own death. And I'll pass on to the death. And so for Ambedkar, the very idea of death is something that is at the heart of the violence that is Hindu society, apart from the fact of his, and to read some of the letters that he had, 3 of his children died. And there is a passage I don't think anyone can read without weeping, where he says, I'm like a gardener tending to weeds now. That is my life. Right? For him, death was a palpable existential condition as well as something that was the philosophical foundation of the society that he sought to change. So I think there are some tremendous particularities, right, in Ambedkar's work. And at some point, it is possible to approach his work through contemporary thinkers, but I don't think I'm at that stage as yet. I'm still trying to understand this persistent and agonized engagement that Ambedkar has with what he sees as the quiddity of Indian society. There's something irresolubly different about India, and which is what he's engaged with, and of course, he isn't able to resolve it.
Can you just, this is very, very profound. Can you just maybe expand a little bit upon where you said this idea of this immeasurable freedom?
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you could help me maybe understand it, on what are the dimensions he's thinking of or looking at that he sees as the immeasurable freedom, because it's even very hard for a person in today's world to imagine what that would look like.
Right.
He probably was looking at something.
See, because the idea of immeasurable freedom, to put it very simply, would be that when one thinks about the framework of a liberal democracy, right, you are granted a freedom to do a set of actions, to be yourself. But these are also freedoms that are granted to you within limits, where they don't impinge upon the freedoms of others and so on. So within the sphere of the law, there is only a freedom that can be given to you which is measured against social norms, traditions, and so on and so forth. So the prospect of liberal democracy can very easily map on to the traditions of caste hierarchy. Right? So in a caste society, when you have liberal democracy and you formulate laws, those laws have to respect the sentiments that already are in existence within a field. And immeasurable equality is not the freedom to do anything one damn well pleases, but it's an equality that exceeds the constraints of custom and the constant commensurability of the law with custom, right? Where law has to be commensurable with custom and the demands of hierarchy. So it's something that escapes that, something that goes beyond that, goes beyond the idea of religion, goes beyond the idea of the law. So in that sense, not measurable by the frameworks that are available within that point, at that given point. I don't know whether that's clear. So it's not immeasurable in some kind of abstract way, but it's to actually escape from that field within which freedom is constantly granted in certain measures, within the paradigm of space of religion, within the space of the law, and these are interlocked spaces, each contaminating the other.
Please, got a question?
Thank you. I have a question of clarification first, to attach something to that. You talked about Maitri and the triad. I think you also mentioned fraternities. So I was wondering if, and the fraternity he derives from, he said, from the French Revolution or maybe certain other values, not Buddhist, let's say. I mean, unless it's a direct translation of Maitri. So does that make a difference, or are these two different things, or he's basically speaking of the same thing? And since it was your reading that you said Maitri gets left out, or maybe that's what he's saying also. There is no fraternity.
Right.
He's saying that. But what would you make, let's say, or what would a reader more familiar with Gandhi make of the feeling that Gandhi operated within the community? And it is said that throughout the country, among so-called common people, Gandhian ideals and Gandhian way of life permeated in a way one person had not been able to do before. So did Gandhi's way of creating community, was it, does it not count? Or was it again driven by caste and all of that? So,
Yes. See, the Gandhian way of creating community was certainly about preserving Varnashrama. Right? This was something that Gandhi was clear till the very end of his life, though he had his own interpretation. Right? Gandhi was very idiosyncratic in his engagement with particular Indian ideas. So Varnashrama, where he said that even a Shudra could be a Brahmin, but in his mind, It is very clear what the qualities of a Brahmin were. So when he says even a Shudra can be a Brahmin, he means somebody who would acquire knowledge, acquire a certain degree of equanimity in life and so on. So it's very clear that Brahmins are not all like that and so on. So he worked with the qualities that were associated with the Varnas and sought to transform them for modern society. So refurbishing, burnishing certain ideas of caste and hierarchy. Hierarchy was very important for Gandhi. You must also remember that Gandhi is somebody who came from a particular tradition. He came from a princely state, right? And he was the descendant of Divans. And we have to keep all of this in mind as well. So even as he thinks through the idea of a political revolution in India, it's a political revolution that will keep intact the idea of hierarchy. In Hind Swaraj, which is written in 1909, right, which is when Gandhi is around 40 years old, it absorbs a lot of the Victorian anxieties regarding the opening up of liberal democracy to the masses. So if you think about the figure of the Satyagrahi, the figure of the Satyagrahi arises out of that anxiety. The fear of mob rule, the fear of the unwashed masses going wild, as it were. So the idea of the Satyagrahi sutures their anxiety. So when you keep all of this in mind, there is a way in which Gandhi is concerned with questions of hierarchy. He's concerned with Indian forms of hierarchy, i.e. caste. He continues to believe, till very late in life, even in the 1940s, 1945s, in the Dalit colony in Delhi, he will not take cooked food from the hand of Dalits even as he lives among them. There are multiple ways in which Gandhi does not transgress the requirements of caste. What is Ambedkar asking? Ambedkar is asking for that transgression which Hindu society was not willing to make then and is not willing to make now. Right? To recognize the other as being like yourself, which is that the idea of Maitri, right? The idea of a fellowship, the idea of fraternity. And he is, there's a particular retort that he makes to somebody when he says, I'm not drawing upon that triad of liberty, equality, and fraternity, right, which comes out of the French Revolution. I'm looking at Maitri as a value in itself. Because liberty and equality come with the kinds of constraints, come within the constraints of religion and the law. Maitri is a demand for a recognition and an embrace of the other, which is outside of those constraints. And this is something that Gandhi never ever ventured into. He never ventured into that kind of terrain. Sorry, do you have something?
Would what's Gandhi's win over the enemy? Would that not be? Would that not be seen as a form of Maitri?
But does Gandhi accord Maitri to the untouchable? That's the question. Does the untouchable come within the space of that Maitri that Gandhi envisages? The answer would have to be no. And there are these various lines that Gandhi constantly draws. To give another instance, in the 1920s, in the non-cooperation movement, this is an argument that's made by Ashwini Tambe. When Ajay Skaria makes the argument about Gandhi's idea of neighborliness and how the ashrams enact a space of equality and so on, Ashwini Tambe asks the question, who is excluded from Gandhi's neighborliness? And in the 1920s, when the non-cooperation movement is at its peak, there are prostitutes, and we call them sex workers now, but prostitutes from Bengal who want to be part of the nationalist movement and who are willing to give their jewels. Gandhi accepts their jewels, but he says you cannot be part of the nationalist movement because that would sully the moral tone. Right? So we are dealing with an individual who is very clear as to who does not belong. Right? Ambedkar is asking for a politics of belonging that is, in some sense, absolute. where the demands of Maitri will include everyone in its embrace. Sorry.
I just have another question, but I think he wanted that, and when he had the power to do this, democracy was not fit to make this happen. So was he proposing any other political system that would allow this like fraternity, however you want to call it, to actually take place? Or
See, the Buddha and his Dhamma was that document that he was working on, which he left at his study as he died, which was actually trying to think through the possibilities of Buddhism, of a radical form of immeasurable equality or brotherhood and so on. And this is a long parallel tendency that is only now beginning to be written about, because from the late 19th century, Buddhism comes to be picked up by untouchable and lower caste thinkers in Tamil Nadu, in Maharashtra, and so on. And Ambedkar is the last in the line of these thinkers. And this turning to Buddhism is to also a turning back to that original movement, right? When Buddhism emerged as a rebellion against the hierarchies and the inequality of Hinduism way back in the 5th century before Christ. So there is a reaching back. It's something that might be called the Walter Benjaminian moment, where you reach back to the past in a moment of danger. You reach back to that moment of Buddhism as a possible way of resolving a landscape of inequality. And that's what Ambedkar was doing, where he's actually drawing upon a very strong tradition of thinking about Buddhism again. And what happens eventually in India is that Buddhism appears in multiple signs and metaphors. Right? So on our national flag, we have the Ashoka Chakra, right? The Mauryan kingdom of the 3rd century BC, which promoted Buddhism. So the Ashoka Chakra appears on the flag. Then you have the lions at Sarnath. So various Buddhist motives are taken into the national Indian symbology, but the very philosophy of Buddhism is present nowhere. Right? It's a curious compromise that is arrived at.
I have two questions. The first question, I'm just curious. Do you have any concrete suggestions to, say, for instance, foster fellowship? And so you have liberal democratic models and constitutions, a very formal aspect. So do you have any concrete, maybe, so, I mean, annihilation of caste? How do you, how do you sort of foster fellowship, intercaste marriages or something like that? And the second question I was because I'm reminded of Du Bois and Menon, all these guys writing at this time. And the title is such that one is, it's sort of taking back to those texts, master and slave and capitality. So when he's talking about the Dalit not having his sovereignty, so lack of sovereignty of self, is he also sort of trying to argue that you have a double consciousness that doesn't realize his self or doesn't have this self-consciousness, just like the other scholars? Or is he getting into capturing at all? Is it doing any psychoanalysis of that? How difficult it is to not have that sovereignty? And so I'm just thinking through those ideas. And that's why this sort of because of course, it's political text and it's the birth of the text has to do with what's happening with India and Gandhi. But the title is itself, taking you through those discourses about double consciousness, the master-slave dynamic, the veil that the Dalit may have, unable to see himself or herself. Because it's always referring to modernity, always referring to the sovereignty of the self. This is lacking because Gandhi is just obsessed with what you said, the mathematical exactitude of numbers.
See, I think we again, what would it mean to read Ambedkar in terms of the argument that he's making, instead of folding it back into notions of the Hegelian dialectic of master and slave, the reading of Kojev that we are all familiar with, the struggle for recognition, a whole set of issues like that, because I think what Ambedkar is trying to understand here is a field of abjection in which all are slaves. Right? some are less slaves than the others, but all are slaves, because that is the ideology of the caste system, which does not allow for autonomy. It does not allow for sovereignty. The Brahmin cannot be other than a Brahmin, right? So it's a different formation that he's addressing. So I'm not sure whether the idea of double consciousness would actually work here, to where modernity is, we tend to see modernity as offering the possibility of freedom. It's not clear that it does. Modernity creates its own forms of subjection and so on. I mean, this is something that you're only too familiar with. So when we think about Ambedkar's addressing of this issue in a landscape of slavery to which all are subject, where the Brahmin and the untouchable are together in this slavery, where the Brahmin is only less a slave, right? Because he has somebody to, so it's a system of graded sovereignty, the question of contempt and reverence, right? All those kinds of issues. The first question as to the concrete steps that he may have taken to promote Maitri, he creates in the constitution the legal grid through which Indians would be able to relate to each other equally, knowing very well, despairing at the same time that it cannot happen. Right? And that's what Congress and Gandhi have done to the Untouchables is really about. It's a document of despair about the possibilities of liberal democracy, but at the same time providing the constitution which could provide a basic rubric. It is a resolution that is the modern resolution, where the law will grant equality and the law will enter into relations among human beings and create a new set of relationships which will be premised on an abstract idea. But he knows that that will not happen. So in that sense, the Constitution can be seen as a concrete step, but it's already something that he has transcended, even as he has written it. And that's so when one thinks about, which is why, I think all our all of our understandings of Ambedkar have to be provisional at the moment also, because he's been reading Buddhism for a fairly long time. The Buddha and his Dhamma is written in the 50s, but even when he writes The Annihilation of Caste in the 1930s, there are all these ideas of shunya, the void, the idea of uchedvad, annihilation, the idea of force, which emerges throughout his writing. So in that sense, there is a trajectory of Buddhist thought that runs through his writings, which as yet I don't think I'm competent to comment on, which is why I'm resisting the comparison. It is very easy to render X in terms of Y. Right? That's the intellectual practice that we are taught at universities, right? Where we take any thinker and make them commensurable with Rousseau, commensurable with Fanon, commensurable. And I don't think that gets us very far. We have to address the quiddity of thought, the incommensurability of certain ideas, that certain ideas are local and we need to deal with the integrity and of that localness. Because I think our entire enterprise is that of making something transparent within another tradition. We are, in that sense, required to do that from colonized societies. Right? That is the weight that we bear. Right? And that's the burden that we bear, and that's a cross that we bear. That Gandhi has to become comprehensible in terms of ideas that come from elsewhere. Right? And that's something that I want to give pause to. So,
How did Ambedkar react to the formation of Pakistan?
Right.
Considering the current political scenario, I'm familiar with Gandhi's reaction.
No, I wouldn't like to speak about it in any great detail right now, but I would recommend that you read Faisal Devji's Muslim Zion, because Ambedkar's Thoughts on Pakistan is a very profound text. I've only begun reading it, so I will not say anything about it right now. But he is certainly for the creation of Pakistan. Right? I mean, and this is something that troubles a lot of his followers, but it's actually the sets of arguments that he makes which allow him to engage with the idea of the creation of Pakistan, which Gandhi also allows for, as you know, that which is actually also about the place of certain groups within a country that is defined within a mode of a religious hierarchy. What is the place of the untouchable? What is the place of the Muslim? See, so it's part of a much larger problematic that he's been thinking about over a period of time. But I'll leave it there. I mean, I don't think I'm as yet comfortable answering in any greater detail. But Faisal Devji has a set of very interesting understandings of what Ambedkar's thoughts on Pakistan would mean, and so does Aishwarya Kumar.
Because often the idea of sovereignty is thought of along with the nation. So does Ambedkar always think of the Dalit sovereign within the Indian nation, or was there ever a time when he contemplated, like, but a separate political intellect or something like that? But did he ever contemplate it as a separate, with the land or nation?
No, I don't think he thinks about it in ways that Ramaswamy Naikar or somebody would, right? Of a Dravidistan or a separate. What he's thinking about is an equality that need not sit alongside the idea of a territorial sovereignty. It's about a political sovereignty and insurrection of the self, right? So which is very different from that of linking it to, where I think one of the trajectories that happens in India, which is in some sense inaugurated by Gandhi, is Gandhi's emergence as a sole spokesperson, which then generates multiple sole spokespersons. Jinnah becomes a sole spokesperson for. He creates a paradigm that then is replicated, but Ambedkar is very much out of that paradigm, where he's asking for something that is much more radical than the resolution of the political nation. Which is why I think he doesn't find any purchase. His ideas don't find much purchase in the Indian political landscape. He's reviled by Marxists, he's reviled by socialists. He isn't even accepted by his own constituency. Right? So when one thinks about the Republican Party and when he stands for elections, people are perplexed by this radical demand that he's making, which is cannot be made commensurable to the language of modernity of class and nation and all the categories which are then so dominant, to go back to the questions that we're all asking. Right? We are requiring a translation of Ambedkar into terms that are not his terms, terms which he fought with, terms that he tried to move beyond.
I mean, just to, when his book was published, initially it was called Pakistan or Partition, maybe Thoughts on Pakistan, and so he was revising the book, and it's just the publisher, Thakkers, maybe. So he writes about that incident when Ambedkar is like, he talks about, and he's revising this, and he said, look, what I did. Now, so, and the country has been created, and Jinnah must be forever kind of, grateful for, what he has proposed in a sense. And the same question is asked. I mean, had Ambedkar, same ideas. I mean, he could write for Pakistan, but why he could not write as a separate entity for Dalits? And that's been a question that keeps on coming after. But you had a question. Somebody had a question? You ask?
Yeah, I guess
Yeah,
I did have a question. When caste is like caste happens before perception almost happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a lot of these societies. But for Gandhi, when he thinks of convincing the Brahmin, of trying to leave that space, from the little I've read, it's like the idea of the Harijan is to convince the equal divinity of the other person, and it's a very religious idea. When Ambedkar thinks about what that journey would look like for a Brahmin to actually rewire himself, what does that look like?
Yeah, actually, I don't think Ambedkar is actually creating a program for the rewiring of the Brahmin. Right? what he is asking for is a rewiring of or a reconceptualization of the very foundation of Indian society. Right? So hence the idea of Maitri, which includes the Brahmin as much as the untouchable, right? Which creates a value for the untouchable and devalues the Brahmin and puts them into a field of fraternity and of fellowship, right? Which is that of equal value.
Yeah, but I understand that, but I guess I'm trying to understand like what the pedagogic, like does he think about if that's the end, what's the means that he's imagining? Because to achieve that end, there still has to have a pedagogical means to it. And I'm curious because I haven't read anything. I'm curious to know if some.
Yeah, I see. The thing about Ambedkar is that unlike Gandhi, he is not interested in the practical politics of many things. Right? He's putting forward philosophical postulates. Right? So this idea of Maitri is a philosophical postulate. To go back to your question, what concrete steps did he envisage? How was this to be brought about, and so on? He presents before us an alternative that will transcend the inequalities of the present. He's not actually spelling out how to do it. The only time he spells it out is when he is forced to. He's forced to write the Constitution. And he knows that those kinds of steps where you create legal safeguards are not sufficient.
Anybody? Last question? Omar.
If nobody else has it. And just to that, would you say that either his engagement with, interrogation of, and also actually adopting another religion, another path, is the practical politics that he presents to the world? So while he might not have specified concrete steps only for Maitri, but Maitri being part of his vision of world, of reading another alternate world, is that the practical step that, okay, that larger system contains within it Maitri, or as you said, the use of discriminative intelligence, pragya, would allow, and that itself is part of the system of Buddhism, would allow for Maitri to be, do you think that's not a prescription, I'm just trying to understand.
Right, I mean, provisionally I would say that is possibly what is suggested in that act of conversion. That act of conversion is a carrying through of that argument about the exercise of a critical intelligence, which then works towards creating a formation within which Maitri rules. So but then again, a lot of these we have to speculate about, right? Because Ambedkar dies shortly, he dies very soon thereafter. So we are left with a question rather than with an answer. But I think, this is again, when we evaluate thinkers in terms of success. Right? And we know that Gandhi fought and won one of the greatest anti-colonial struggles. Right? And that itself seems to give a power to his ideas. We tend to think about Ambedkar and we think about a man who writes a constitution about which he is deeply ambivalent and then leaves and then converts and then he dies. And somehow that seems to mark the way in which we think about it in terms of, okay, this is probably not a solution. Right? Because in the end he convinced very few. And so on and so forth. And I'm, as a historian, I'm not very happy with the idea that it's only success that guarantees, the success of an idea that guarantees its validity or is underwrites its validity. And again, maybe if you ask me this question 10 years from now when I've read more of Ambedkar, I'll have a more intelligent answer to give you, but this is all I can say for the moment.
On that, you want to ask something? Go for it.
Are you Buddhist today?
No, actually I'm an atheist.
On that note, I would also like to thank the live audience who have stuck around. Thank you to you. And we have a listserv if you guys would like to. Ambedkar Lecture Series at Harvard is every month, and we have distinguished speakers like Professor Menon. who come and deliberate on the question of universe through the idea of caste and race and class. So if you want to be on the list, please join in. And thank you all for coming. Let's thank Professor Menon for his talk.
Thank you so much.
Who are you? How's your semester going?